So I'm going to talk about abilities. Everyday thought and conduct suggests that we put great stock in the acquisition, maintenance, and development of practical abilities or competencies, capacities. However, philosophers of action have surprisingly little to say about them. When they've tried to explain what action is, their accounts typically appeal only to mental states, such as belief, desire, and intention, mental processes, such as deliberation or practical reasoning, bodily movements, and event causation, or sometimes agent causation. So abilities aren't given an explanatory role in this, the kinds of accounts that are given. On the one hand, many philosophers are interested in the explanation of actions in terms of the reasons for which, or motives from which, the agent acted. For example, when the fact that Amy raised her arm is explained by the fact that she wanted to attract the chair's attention and believed that raising her arm was an appropriate means of doing so. Now, such ordinary action explanations presuppose that action has occurred, and they aspire to explain it by laying out which among the various motives and reasons someone might have had for so acting were in fact the agents. And these are motives and reasons that render it intelligible why she should have acted as she did and not in some other way. But an explanation of this form doesn't purport to tell us what it is for someone to, for instance, raise or have raised her arm. On the other hand, the so-called standard story of action aims to take the materials of these sorts of ordinary action explanations and fashion them into a reductive account of what action is. What it is for someone to have raised her arm is for appropriate mental states, for instance, a desire to attract the chair's attention and a belief that raising one's arm is a way to do so, to have appropriately caused her arm's rising. If an arm rising has the right kind of causal ancestry, it counts as an arm raising. That is an action, something the agent did. But if an arm rising has some other kind of causal ancestry, it's a mere arm rising, not an action, but something that merely happened to the person whose arm it is. And the idea of an arm rising here, or rather a bodily movement more generally, is understood as something that's intrinsically non-agential. It's taken as basic in these accounts. Now, it's sometimes objected that this standard story or causal theory of action leaves the agent out. There was an intrinsically non-agential arm rising, which was caused by a belief and a desire, perhaps by way of an intention. And because it was so caused, that arm rising counts as someone's raising her arm. Now, to be sure, it was her belief, it was her desire, her intention, and it was her arm, but it's sometimes said anyway, to locate the agent in the story just in this way doesn't yet amount to characterizing her as doing anything. So on the one hand, what's explained in an ordinary action explanation is already given as an action, and the explanation doesn't offer an account of what that is. And on the other hand, the standard story of action is a story about one kind of causal pathway that eventuates in a bodily movement, such that a bodily movement that eventuates in that way gets called an action, but neither the bodily movement nor anything in the pathway is a candidate for what someone's acting consists in. Well, in these opening remarks, I've just followed points made some time ago by Jennifer Hornsby. Now, Hornsby wrote, and this is number 1 on the handout, that in the standard story of action, the fact that a person exercises a capacity to bring something about is suppressed. It's forgotten that the agent's causal part is taken for granted as soon as she's said to have done something. The species of causality that belongs with the relevant idea of a person's exercising her capacities is concealed. So once we have in view someone's having done something, we have in view her having exercised some of her agential capacities. When we inquire why she did what she did, we don't explicate what it was for her to have exercised those capacities. On the other hand, if we begin with a bodily movement that, for all we know, may or may not be an action, may or may not have been someone's exercising some agential capacities of hers, and if we come to learn that it was an action because it was appropriately caused by appropriate mental states, then we've still not said anything about the role of the agent's capacities and their exercise in her acting. Now, as the quotation from Hornsby indicates, Hornsby suggests that the agent's causal part, her acting, her doing something, resides in her exercising her capacities, or as I'll call them today, her abilities. But this isn't an idea that Hornsby further explicates. So I thought this would be a good idea to try and explicate this, although I haven't yet got very far. And what I'm going to do today is mostly sort of ground clearing work to make it possible to try and explicate Hornsby's thought. Having said that, I don't think that one needs to be dissatisfied with the standard story or causal theory of action in order to be interested in abilities. Indeed, Randolph Clark, who himself defends a version of the causal theory, writes, and this is number 2 on the handout, abilities are fundamental to agency. We don't have a decent comprehension of agency without an understanding of them. Nevertheless, with a few notable exceptions, I'm thinking of work by Gilbert Ryle, Anthony Kenny, Annette Beyer, with those few exceptions, philosophers working on the metaphysics of agency have largely ignored the concept of ability. And this is all the more surprising when we notice that philosophers working in other areas and on other topics make frequent use of the concept of ability. For instance, in epistemology, there are virtue epistemologists, such as Ernest Sosa and John Greco, who have attempted to account for the nature and value of knowledge in terms of its being an exercise of epistemic abilities or competencies. And John Hyman has recently been arguing that knowledge itself is an ability. He argues that one knows that P if and only if one has the ability to phi for the reason that P. In the literature on the compatibility or incompatibility of free will, moral responsibility, and determinism, something called the ability to do otherwise is very often at issue. Harry Frankfurt famously argued that one could be morally responsible for doing something even if one lacked the ability to do otherwise. And in recent work, Kadri Vivilan has argued that free will and moral responsibility do require the ability to do otherwise, but that having this ability, or having abilities to do otherwise, is compatible with determinism. And she defends a version of the view that for one to have the ability to phi, to perform some action, is for one to be disposed to phi if one has the opportunity to phi and tries to phi. And indeed, the connection between abilities and dispositions is also made by those philosophers who work on the metaphysics of dispositions or powers. And though work in this area typically focuses on simple dispositions like fragility, solubility, flammability, and so on, it usually aspires to a systematic account of dispositionality or potentiality that encompasses human qualities such as the habit of smoking, the character trait of irascibility, and the ability to play the piano. Philosophers working on all these topics frequently provide a partial account of ability, what's needed in order to make the claims they're really interested in making. And that's fine, right? They've got their own interests and agendas. But my plan is to discuss, from an action theoretical point of view, several important questions and the relationships between them that emerge piecemeal from these projects. So some of the questions I'll consider today are, if one phis, if one does something, does one have the ability to phi? What is it for one person to have a greater ability to phi than another? How are abilities properly specified or individuated? Is the ability to phi a two-way power? These are the questions that I'll address. Now, throughout, I'm going to assume that we're after a conception of ability on which it's genuinely explanatory. It seems hard to see why abilities would be fundamental to agency and why we'd lack a decent comprehension of agency without an understanding of abilities if this weren't so. Before I get going, I'll just say a little bit more to isolate the topic. Now, of course, in ordinary English, the expressions has the ability to such and is able to blah, 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 take a wide variety of complements. So in addition to act and activity descriptions, such as the ability to hit the bullseye, the ability to run a 4-minute mile, the ability to walk, the ability to play the piano, we also find things like the ability to tell a hawk from a handsaw, the ability to understand French, the ability to recall someone's name and face after meeting them only once, the ability to fall asleep on buses. Now, I don't think there are very great prospects for understanding the concept of ability if it's taken in the full generality of uses of the word in English. I'm going to restrict my attention to what I'm thinking of as our practical abilities, those abilities that are such as to issue involuntary or intentional action. And so that means that, in particular, recognitional abilities aren't going to be my focus, but I do want to say I don't think that sort of recognitional abilities and practical abilities are somehow disjoint and have got nothing to do with one another. Very many practical abilities involve subsume recognitional abilities and other sorts of dispositions as well. But it's the sort of practical abilities, the ability to play the piano, the ability to walk, the ability to speak French, things like this, that's going to be my topic. Well, I think if anything constitutes a default view about practical abilities, it's that they're dispositions, or probably dispositions of some distinctive kind. So in number 3 on the handout, This is from Stephen Mumford, who at the beginning of a book called Dispositions writes, "I take it that the dispositional is a genus that can accommodate these subclasses, namely tendencies, capacities and incapacities, powers and forces, potentialities and propensities, abilities and liabilities, etc., as species." He says, "The belief that 8/8 are 64 may be a capacity, fragility may be a liability, bravery may be a tendency. We can grant these classifications. Of the set of related terms, some may be taken as equivalent to dispositions, such as powers and potentialities, but other terms, such as tendency, ability, and propensity, may refer to dispositions of a particular kind." And in number 4, Kadri Vivilan says that to have an ability to act is to have a disposition or bundle of dispositions. So the idea here is that Amy has the ability to play the piano, or the ability to run a 4-minute mile, or the ability to cook spaghetti bolognese, isn't to say anything about what she's currently doing. It's to say something about what she would do if such and such happened, or such and such were the case, or it's to say something about what she can or could do. And one finds in discussions of abilities and dispositions 2 main ways of thinking about them, and they correspond to making central one or the other of these ideas. That in ascribing a disposition to an object or an ability to an agent, we say something about what it or she would do if, or that we say something about what it or she can or could do, sort of without the if. Right? So according to the first view, this is the counterfactual conditional view, to have the ability to phi is to be such that were you to have the opportunity to phi and try to phi, you would phi. Right? So we move from the idea that S has the ability to phi to the idea that S is disposed to phi in propitious circumstances if she tries to, and then the gloss on that is a counterfactual conditional. If S were in such circumstances and tried to phi, S would phi. And this parallels a very standard account of dispositions, according to which X has a disposition D, fragility, solubility, or so on. If X is disposed to manifest a certain property, breaking, say, in conditions C, such as being struck, and then the idea is that some counterfactual conditional tells us what it would be for that to be so. If X were in those conditions, X would manifest that property. Now that view of dispositions is often referred to as the simple conditional analysis. And it faces a number of well-known counterexamples that would appear to show that satisfying the proposed counterfactual conditional is neither necessary nor sufficient for possession of the disposition. Now, as often happens in philosophy, when we get these kind of counterexamples, they sort of mark a fork in the road. So some philosophers push on, coming up with ever more complicated analysis intended to get around the counterexamples, whereas others sort of give up on that kind of analysis altogether. And so some philosophers give up on the project of linking dispositions with counterfactual conditionals. Those philosophers may prefer the second view of ability, the restricted possibility view. On this view, the idea is that someone who has the ability to phi is someone who can phi. And here the idea is that we understand the claim that it's metaphysically possible for someone to phi in terms of the idea that there's some possible world in which they phi, and we understand the idea that someone has the ability to phi, that they can phi in the sense of can that ascribes ability, in terms of the idea that there's some possible world from among a restricted set of possible worlds in which they phi. So different senses or uses of can are going to determine different restricted sets of possible worlds to look at. On the restricted possibility view, what distinguishes an ability from a disposition is that the subject of an ability is an agent, or perhaps an agent insofar as she is an agent, and that the manifestation of an ability is an action. The counterfactual conditional view can also appeal to the distinctive role of trying in abilities to distinguish them from dispositions. Now, towards the end of the talk, I'm going to return to the differences between these two views and to the ways in which they distinguish abilities from other kinds of dispositions. But my main focus is going to be on difficulties that I think certain action theoretical reflections pose for understanding abilities on the model of dispositions, regardless of which of these two views we take. Before I get to those questions, though, I just want to briefly mention and discuss what seems to me a rather curious but nevertheless pervasive feature of recent writing on abilities. Okay. So some philosophers distinguish different kinds of ability on the basis of different senses or uses of expressions like S is able to phi or S has the ability to phi. So a distinction is frequently drawn between general abilities and specific abilities. And it's a somewhat curious use of general and specific in these terms. A tennis player is said to have the general ability to play tennis, something that someone who's never played it lacks. But in the absence of a racket or a ball or an opponent and so on, she's said to lack the specific ability to play tennis. In the absence of that equipment, say, she can or is able to play tennis generally, but she can't or isn't able to play tennis here and now, to play it specifically. An agent who has a specific ability to play tennis needn't, of course, actually be playing tennis, but as John Mayer puts it, there is, as it were, nothing between her and the deed. Some philosophers distinguish a third kind of ability that sits between these two. So Vivian contrasts two prisoners, both of whom, due to their predicament, lack the specific ability to ride a bicycle, and one of whom, I'm sorry to say, is you. So number 5 on the handout, this is Vivian. She says, you've got more than bike riding skills. That is, you've got more than the general ability to ride a bike. You also have what it takes to ride a bike right now. Your legs aren't broken, you're conscious and without any pathological fear of bikes that might prevent your bike riding attempts from succeeding. The problem's with your unfortunate surroundings, not with you. But in the cell next door to yours is another prisoner who used to be a champion cyclist. He's not lost his bike riding skills, but he's just polished off an entire bottle of vodka and is so hopelessly drunk that he's unable to walk a straight line, let alone ride a bike. There is a relevant distinction between the two of you. I certainly agree there's a relevant distinction. Now, Vivian concludes that there's a kind of ability to phi, she calls it narrow ability, that corresponds to an agent's having the necessary skills, the general ability, and the psychological and physical capacity to use those skills. Narrow ability doesn't require what specific ability requires, the absence of external obstacles or impediments or the presence of external enabling conditions. Right? So it sort of sits between general and specific ability. And Ernest Sosa has also got a 3 kinds of ability scheme like Vivian's. But in my view, it's at best misleading to speak of either 2 or 3 different kinds of ability on the basis of considerations such as these. It seems to me that we've got 3 different kinds of factors that might explain why someone is not in a position to do something. She may lack the ability to do it, she may lack the opportunity to do it, or she may be prevented from exercising her ability by injury, inebriation, fear, phobia, unconsciousness, and so on. Now, of course, in ordinary English, we may say that she's unable to do it, and perhaps that she lacks the ability to do it in any of these kinds of cases, right? That's fine. Ordinary language is used for much more than doing philosophy. But in our thought about metaphysics of agency, I think we ought to be more precise. Abilities and opportunities are quite different sorts of explanatory factors. As Anthony Kenny insisted, abilities are inherently general, whereas opportunities are constituted by particular situations or occasions. So, for instance, Serena Williams has the ability to hit a forehand winner down the line on the run. And it's the same ability that she exercises whenever she hits one. But the opportunities to hit one come and go, and some of them she doesn't take. Though there are uses of can, is able to, and has the ability to, that convey that an agent has the ability and the opportunity to do something, this doesn't justify us in invoking a kind of ability that's constituted by the co-presence of these factors. So I think the idea of a specific ability, in the sense I introduced it, is just a misnomer. Well, what of the middle kind of ability introduced in Vivian's 3-part scheme? I think that's a misnomer too, while again, I'm perfectly happy to concede that there are uses in ordinary English of can, is able to, and has the ability to, on which the imprisoned but sober cyclist has the ability to cycle, whereas the imprisoned but blind drunk cyclist lacks the ability to cycle. Now, you're said by Vivian to have the psychological and physical capacity to use your bike riding skills insofar as you don't have broken legs, you're conscious, you're not pathologically afraid of bikes, you aren't drunk. But someone who's inebriated or injured doesn't lack a physical ability to exercise her abilities to ride a bike or play tennis. Rather, she's under a condition that prevents her from exercising her abilities to ride a bike or play tennis. One doesn't need abilities to exercise abilities in the way that might suggest. Similarly, with the psychological impediments to the exercise of one's general abilities. There can be psychological roadblocks to exercising abilities that need to be overcome, but overcoming them is not acquiring an ability to try to do the thing in question. Like removing a literal roadblock, removing a psychological roadblock is removing an obstacle to exercising one's abilities, not acquiring an ability to make use of one's abilities. So moving forward then, I'm just going to assume that from a metaphysical point of view, the only abilities that we ought to countenance are what many call general abilities. So moving on to the second page of the handout, Anthony Kenny writes, "A skill or ability is always a positive explanatory factor in accounting for the performance of an agent. An opportunity is often no more than a negative factor, the absence of circumstances that would prevent or interfere with that performance." And I suppose my question is, how would philosophers of action have to conceive or reconceive of abilities for them to be candidates to play a genuine explanatory role? And I think if I'm right, a substantial rethink is in order. I want to look first at three issues: the robustness or reliability of abilities, the so-called gradeability of abilities, the idea that abilities come in degrees, and the proper specification or individuation of abilities. Now these issues are interrelated, so there's going to be a certain amount of moving back and forth between them. But first though, what's the logical relation between ability and action? Right? So number 7 on the handout, Peter Geach writes, "Ab esse ad posset valet consequentia." What is can be, what a man does he can do. That is clear if anything in modal logic's clear. And J.L. Austin says that of course it follows merely from the premise that he does it, that he has the ability to do it, at least according to ordinary English. But in fact many, perhaps most, writers on ability explicitly deny that successful action suffices for ability. That is, they deny that if S phies, S has the ability to phi. So, for instance, Kenny, Vivian, Barbara Vetter, Don Locke, Peter Hacker, John Hyman, all of these philosophers who have written recently on ability deny that success suffices for ability. Now, Kenny gives an example that occurs frequently in the literature. This is number 9 on the handout. A hopeless darts player may once in a lifetime hit the bull, but be unable to repeat the performance because he doesn't have the ability to hit the ball. The idea is that ability requires more than mere possibility. Abilities are supposed to be reliable and robust and make it the case that the performances in which their exercises consist are under the agent's control. But even though the hopeless darts player hit the bullseye, he can't robustly and reliably hit it. Hitting it's not within his control. His hitting it was down to luck, not to ability, as it will be if he ever hits it again. So this is why Kenny says, counterexamples similar to this will always be imaginable whenever it's possible to do something by luck rather than by skill. On the other hand, though abilities are robust, they're not infallible, and so don't guarantee or suffice for success, as a famous example from Austin illustrates. This is number 10 on the handout. Austin says, "Consider the case in which I miss a very short putt and kick myself because I could have holed it. It's not that I should have holed it if I tried. I did try and missed. It's not that I should have holed it if circumstances, conditions had been different. Well, maybe that might of course be so, but I'm talking about conditions precisely as they were, and asserting that I could have holed it. There's the rub. According to the traditional beliefs enshrined in the word can, a human ability, or power, or capacity, is inherently liable not to produce success on occasion, and that for no reason, or a bad luck and bad form, sometimes reasons." So actual success in performance on any particular occasion then seems to be neither necessary nor sufficient for ability. And for this reason we get accounts like the following, V, G and K on the handout. V is from Vivian, who says that S has the narrow ability at time t to do R as a result of trying, that is, in response to the stimulus of S's trying to do R, if and only if, for some intrinsic property B that S has at t and for some time t prime after t, if S had the opportunity at t to do R and S tried to do R while retaining property B until time t prime, then in a suitable proportion of these cases S is trying to do R and S is having of B would be an S complete cause of S is doing R. This is an awful mouthful. If anyone's at all familiar with literature or discussions of dispositions and powers, you may notice that what's happened here is Vivian has sort of plugged in one of these complicated accounts of dispositions that I mentioned earlier on in an attempt to get around counterexamples into her account of ability. What she's basically saying is S has the ability to phi just in case. If S had the opportunity to phi and tried to phi, then in a suitable proportion of such cases, S would succeed. That's basically what's going on in that mouthful. John Greco in G says, this is another kind of complicated account, he says abilities have the following structure. S has an ability ARC relative to an environment E, just in case, across the set of relevantly close possible worlds W, where S is in condition C and in environment E, S has a high rate of success in achieving result R. Perhaps more straightforwardly, Kenny says that there's this much truth in the conditional analysis of ability. He says, I can phi entails if I have the opportunity to phi, and if I do my best to phi, then I normally will phi. Now, of course, what makes for a suitable proportion of cases or a suitably high rate of success and what it takes to normally or regularly succeed must inevitably differ for different abilities. In some cases, a 50% rate of success would be evidence of lack of ability, just mere chance. It's luck, not ability, that accounts for my getting heads when I flip a coin, if I do. But there are lots of abilities for which a 50% success rate would be evidence of outstanding or even unthinkable ability. The basketball player Stephen Curry, an outstanding three-point shooter, is making just over 45% of his three-point shots this season. The best hitter in Major League Baseball last year, Miguel Cabrera, hit the ball in play a shade under 34% of the time. And Dale Steyn, cricket's best bowler, has the ability to take wickets if anyone does, but he takes a wicket on average only once every 41 balls he bowls. So ability can tolerate quite low probabilities of success, depending on the difficulty of the task, and lack of ability can be consistent with relatively high probabilities of success. Now, even though there may be difficulties in figuring out what counts as a normal or regular or suitably high rate of success in different cases, views like these I just read, V, G, and K, seem to lend themselves quite naturally to providing an account of what it is for an ability to come in degrees. The coming in degreeness, or gradeability as it's sometimes called, of abilities is certainly an idea that's well entrenched in ordinary thought and practice. Amy's a better runner than Belinda. Brian's a more able swimmer than Charles. Chloe shows greater ability at darts than David, and I'm trying to get better at playing the piano. These sorts of accounts, V, G, and K, provide for two dimensions in which one agent's ability might be greater than another's. On the one hand, her attempts might succeed at a higher rate. This is what we're looking at explicitly in baseball batting averages, for instance. On the other hand, there might be a wider range of circumstances in which the more able agent's attempts succeed. So, for instance, 20-knot winds might prevent a beginner sailor from even going out on the water, while providing a more experienced sailor with the opportunity for an exciting sail. Accounts that have a place for trying, at least depending on how trying is conceived of, may provide for another dimension of gradeability. Belinda has the ability to run a 5-minute mile, but only if she really, really tries. By contrast, Amy, a better runner, can run a 5-minute mile easily, without really trying. She barely breaks a sweat. Now, the resources provided by higher rate of success and success in a wider range of circumstances seem well suited to accounting for the gradeability of some abilities. So Steph Curry's extremely high ability to make three-point basketball shots is shown both by his making them at a much higher than average percentage, but also by his succeeding more often with more difficult attempts than his peers. So he makes them not just from the corner of the court where the distance is shorter, but from all around the three-point line, not just when there's no defender near, but when someone's trying to block the ball and so on. Okay. But this account of gradeability looks much less promising when we think about those abilities whose exercises don't have neat binary conditions for success or failure, like making a basket or hitting the bullseye and so on. Binary conditions that match those of the metaphysician's favourite dispositions, fragility and solubility. You know, it either breaks or it doesn't, it dissolves or it doesn't. So consider, Belinda can run a 5-minute mile, but only if she really tries, whereas Amy can run a 5-minute mile with ease. It's not merely that Amy is such as to succeed in running a 5-minute mile with a higher rate of success than Belinda. Indeed, this might not even be true. Though Belinda needs to really try, perhaps she always does really try, she always gives 100%. Nor is it that Amy, unlike Belinda, can run a 5-minute mile not only when it's warm and dry, but when it's cold and wet, and on grass, not only on the track, and so on. Again, these things might not even be true. Amy might be very sensitive to the conditions. Right? Amy's greater ability as a runner doesn't have to do with how frequently or under what conditions she runs a 5-minute mile. That she, unlike Belinda, can run a 5-minute mile with ease suggests that she can run a mile in well under 5 minutes. She doesn't have the ability to run a 5-minute mile better than Belinda. She's a better miler or better middle distance runner because she, unlike Belinda, can run a 4-minute mile. And this explains why, when she decides to run a 5-minute mile, in training for instance, she can do so with ease. So she's a better miler or better middle distance runner because she runs faster miles. Similarly, Chloe's ability to do push-ups is greater than David's, not because she's such as to succeed in doing a push-up with a higher degree of success than he is, or because she can do push-ups in a wider range of circumstances, but because she can do more push-ups. For many of the physical or athletic abilities that we grade or evaluate, being better at doing something will be understood in terms of physical magnitude, running faster, throwing things further, doing more push-ups, lifting heavier weights. But this isn't the only kind of way in which one agent's ability may be greater than another's that escapes the 2 dimensions of gradability suggested by accounts of ability based on dispositions. Yevgeny Kissin is a much, much better pianist than me. Now, he can indeed play the piano faster than me, but that doesn't sound particularly promising as an account of the superiority of his ability. He can play more pieces than me, but more importantly, he can play more difficult pieces than me. He can play the Appassionata Sonata, I cannot. If I tried to play the Appassionata, I'd fail. But I wouldn't fail to play the piano. The opening bars aren't even very difficult. It's difficult later on. It's not that his ability to play the Appassionata is greater than mine, because when he tries, he succeeds, whereas were I to try, I'd fail. I don't have the ability to play the Appassionata at all. Right? We wanted to understand how my ability to play the piano, not to play the Appassionata, we want to understand how my ability to play the piano is exceeded by Kissin's. Right? Yet it would be a rare occurrence indeed for me to try to play the piano but fail. Kissin is a better pianist than me not because he succeeds in playing the piano with a higher rate of success or in a wider range of circumstances than I do, but because he plays more accurately and more musically than I do and can play more challenging pieces. So there are evidently normative and evaluative dimensions to the gradability of ability that don't belong to the account of what it is for one object to be more fragile than another, one substance to be more flammable than another, and so on. It seems clear that these normative considerations will apply to our conception of what it is to successfully exercise at least some abilities too. Being better at flying may often be a matter not or not merely of one's successes being more frequent or reliable, but of one's successes being better successes. So think of the craftsman or the artist who turns out a better product. Brian may be better than Charles at making pots because the pots he makes are better pots. And I think these considerations ought to undermine our confidence in the idea that abilities can be distinguished from dispositions simply by characterizing their manifestations as actions rather than other sorts of events, or their subjects as agents rather than other sorts of things. In thinking about what it is for Amy to be a better middle distance runner than Belinda, or for Kissin to be a better pianist than me, we find ourselves running up against a different but related issue: how to properly specify or individuate abilities and how to understand the relations between them. For instance, what's the relationship between the ability to run a mile, the ability to run a 4-minute mile, and the ability to run a 5-minute mile? What's the relationship between the ability to play the piano, the ability to play Fiordalisa, and the ability to play the Appassionata? Now, the proper specification or individuation of abilities is not an issue that's received much attention in recent philosophical discussion, as the following bewildering array of abilities on this list that I've taken more or less at random from the literature suggests. So we've got the ability to move one's limbs, the ability to raise my hand, the ability to sink a 3-foot putt, to dress in a kilt, to stand on my head on commuter trains, to row a straight line in a crosswind, to sing when one's aunt is present, to read Emma, to read Persuasion, to read Werther, to speak French, to ride a bike, to sing in tune, to juggle, to kiss the Blarney Stone, to know that P, to pronounce the name Luigi, to fie for the reason that P, to marry for the sake of love, to marry for the sake of money. Now, on this list, there are some highly abstract abilities, for instance, the ability to move one's limbs. Which ones? How? Where? There are some extremely specific abilities, for instance, the ability to read Emma, the ability to stand on my head on commuter trains. There are abilities that require particular objects, and not just objects of particular kinds for their exercise, the ability to kiss the Blarney Stone. We find distinguished the ability to fly for one reason from the ability to do the very same thing for a different reason. And of course we find such humdrum and everyday abilities as the ability to speak French, sing in tune, ride a bike, and so on. Now again, I don't propose to legislate on whether or not it's correct speech to ascribe any of these abilities. As I said, ordinary language is used for more than metaphysics. But when we're doing metaphysics, we should be more precise. What sorts of specifications of abilities should be allowed or rejected in philosophy, and why? How should we individuate abilities? What do we have abilities to do? Now, I want to suggest that in most cases, we should individuate abilities more coarsely than in many of these examples. Now, obviously, I'm not going to discuss the details of all these examples here, so I want to consider instead a rare concrete proposal for the individuation of abilities that's due to John Hyman. So this is at the top of page 3 on the handout, what I'm going to call Hyman's principle. Hyman says, for all phi and psi, the ability to phi and the ability to psi are different abilities if it's possible to have one without having the other. Now, Hyman's principle yields a fairly fine-grained individuation of abilities. As he points out, continuing that quotation, it follows that the ability to run a mile in 4 minutes and the ability to run a mile in 5 minutes are different abilities, since it's possible to have the second without having the first, even though it's not possible to have the first without having the second. And indeed, it follows that having the ability to run, the ability to run a mile is a different ability as well. Chloe has the ability to run a mile, but she can't run a 5, let alone a 4-minute mile. Belinda can run a 5, but not a 4-minute mile, and Amy can run a 4-minute mile. So by Hyman's principle, we've got 3 different abilities, of which Chloe possesses 1, Belinda 2, and Amy all 3. Similarly, someone may have the ability to play the piano without having the ability to play either Fiorelisa or the Appassionata. Though possessing either of the more specific abilities entails the ability to play the piano, neither of those more specific abilities entails the other. An average pianist may have the ability to play Fiorelisa quite well, but not the difficult Appassionata. And a strong pianist who's learnt the Appassionata may simply never have had Fiorelisa in her repertoire. Again, Hyman's principle entails that there are 3 distinct abilities here. However, though he claims that such abilities are distinct, Hyman acknowledges that they're nevertheless related. He says, this is number 12 on the handout, I'm skipping what was in number 11. Number 12, Hyman says, running a mile in 5 minutes and running a mile in 4 minutes are both species of the generic act of running a mile, and the corresponding abilities are related in the same way, so species and genus. Presumably he'd say the same thing in the piano case. The ability to play the Appassionata and the ability to play Fiorelisa are species of the generic ability to play the piano. But is the genus-species model really the right one here? It's true that running a mile takes time, and so any act of running a mile will take a certain period of time. Any ability to run a mile will be possessed to some degree, and the grade of someone's ability to run a mile will be specified by a time. So far, so good for species-genus here. But the species of a genus, or the determinants of a determinable, exclude each other. Nothing can be a mammal without being either a human or a cow or a cat and so on. But equally, nothing can be both a cow and a cat. Nothing can be unicoloured all over without being red all over, or green all over, or blue all over, and so on. But equally, nothing can be red all over and green all over. Yet Amy has the ability to run a 4-minute mile and the ability to run a 5-minute mile. So the species abilities don't exclude each other. So the more fine-grained act types aren't species of a generic act of running a mile, and the more fine-grained abilities aren't species of a generic ability. So at the very least then, Hyman's principle needs to be supplemented with an alternative conception of the relation between the more general and more specific abilities that he insists are distinct. But one might well wonder, I think, whether we might be better off with a different principle of individuation altogether. And I think the motivation comes for this in an idea which seems fairly obvious, but it's in a quotation from Don Locke. This is number 13 on the handout. Locke writes, I can, for instance, walk down Park Street, and I can also walk down State Street. I'll succeed in doing these things if I try. But this surely doesn't mean I've got 2 abilities, the ability to walk down Park Street and the ability to walk down State Street. There's but one ability, the ability to walk, manifested in 2 different performances, in 2 different contexts. Again, the athlete who runs a 4-minute mile, also in the same performance, runs a 5-minute mile, but he doesn't thereby exercise or manifest 2 abilities. By that token, he'd be manifesting an infinity of abilities. And so Locke suggests an alternative principle for individuating abilities, one that does so more coarsely than Hyman's. So here's Locke's principle. If those features from an agent's constitution and background which bring it about that he standardly succeeds in doing X are also sufficient to bring it about that he standardly succeeds in doing Y, then we're dealing here not with two separate abilities, but with the one ability to do X and do Y. So Amy can run a 4-minute mile, and a fortiori can run a 5-minute mile. The features of her constitution and background that underwrite her standardly succeeding in running a 4-minute mile are also sufficient for her standardly succeeding in running a 5-minute mile. So Locke's principle seems to imply then that we're dealing here not with two separate abilities, but a single ability. The ability to run a 4-minute mile and the ability to run a 5-minute mile are the same ability. But of course, Belinda can run a 5-minute mile, but not a 4-minute mile. Those features of her constitution and background that underwrite her standardly succeeding in running a 5-minute mile aren't sufficient for her standardly succeeding in running a 4-minute mile. Locke's principle implies that we're dealing with two separate abilities. But when we put these results together, they suggest absurdly that the ability to run a 4-minute mile both is and isn't the same ability as the ability to run a 5-minute mile. So maybe Locke's principle is no good. But of course, the absurd conclusion derives from an obvious misinterpretation of Locke's idea. Locke's principle, I think, yields the verdict that Amy's ability to run a 4-minute mile and her ability to run a 5-minute mile are the same ability, and that Belinda's ability to run a 5-minute mile isn't an ability to run a 4-minute mile. It would seem to follow from Locke's principle, then, that there's no answer to the question whether the ability to do X and the ability to do Y are the same ability or not. There are answers only to the question whether so-and-so's ability to do X and her ability to do Y are the same ability or not. Now, in fact, it might be better to put the point slightly differently to avoid giving the unnecessary impression that contingent identities are being proposed here. For instance, the identity of Amy's ability to run a 4-minute mile with her ability to run a 5-minute mile. The point is that Amy and Belinda both have the ability to run, but in each of them, that ability is differently specified in concreto. Amy's ability to run is such that she can exercise it in running a 4-minute mile, whereas Belinda's is not. When Belinda exercises her ability to run in running a mile, she does 5-minute miles. It lies within Amy's power to run a 4-minute mile, whereas a 5-minute mile is the best mile it's within Belinda's power to run. But in each of them, it's the power to run, rather than a more narrowly specified power, that's exercised when they run a mile in however long it takes them. The respective shapes of their abilities to run are different. So Amy, we're saying, is a better middle distance runner than Belinda, but perhaps Belinda's better at sprinting than Amy. More generally then, we can say that the different shapes taken by an ability in its being possessed by different agents may show themselves in a variety of ways. Now, when the ability is properly specified by an action type that captures what was done in a performance, the shape of the agent's ability in concreto may show itself in the proportion of successes to attempts, the range of circumstances that constitute opportunities in which the agent succeeds, or the quality of the success itself. But, very often, an ability is properly specified more coarsely than the specification of what was done on an occasion of its exercise. The ability to play the piano may be exercised in a performance of the appassionata. Obviously, in playing the appassionata, the agent is playing the piano, but in an ordinary case, what she's really up to is playing the appassionata, not just playing the piano. So the specific shape of an agent's ability in concreto to play the piano or to run may be partially brought out, partially indicated, by saying which pieces are within her ability or repertoire, or how far she can run in what time. But such characterizations, of which there'll be many for any given ability, are characterizations of the shape taken by a single ability, not the characterization of several different abilities. A specification of what it's within an agent's abilities to do is not thereby a specification of one of her abilities. This is a way of insisting on the generality of ability. But whereas it's quite common for philosophers, for instance Kenny, to insist that abilities are general insofar as they're realized in distinct token actions of a type that specifies the ability, I've been arguing that abilities are sort of more general than that. They're general insofar as they can be realized in distinct actions of distinct, though related, types. Therefore, the specification of the ability, what it is an ability to do, can't be arrived at simply by reading it off the act type or act form realized by the concrete performance, a playing of the appassionata. So I prefer Don Locke's principle for individuating abilities to John Hyman's. Nevertheless, there's something I want to take issue with briefly in Locke's principle, and that's his reliance on the idea of succeeding in doing something. Right? And just by looking at this, we'll revisit the idea that I sort of let pass without challenge earlier, that Kenny, Hyman, Locke, and all the others are correct to reject Geach and Austin's claim that successful action suffices for ability. Now, what seems to be in play in the ubiquitous example of the inept darts thrower who flukily hits the bull is a certain conception of what it is to act, or to act successfully, on which acting consists in the bringing about of certain states of affairs. What it is to do something, thusly conceived, is to a degree independent of the idea that the specified state of affairs is brought about through the exercise of ability. Now, Volitional is quite explicit about this. This is number 14 at the bottom of page 3 of the handout. Volitional says, there are many ways to do something. One way is by having the ability, another way is by accident or lucky fluke, yet another way is by having one's brain and body moved puppet-like in the appropriate ways by a sorcerer. Doing something by accident or lucky fluke doesn't entail having the ability to do it. Doing something due to direct manipulation by someone else doesn't entail having the ability to do it. This shows that the fact that S does A does not entail that S has the ability to do A. Now, it's in fact far from clear to me, and I imagine far from clear to most philosophers of action, that having one's brain and body moved puppet-like in the appropriate ways by a sorcerer is a way of doing something, as opposed to a way of suffering something, a way of having something done to one. But there's certainly a conception of action on which one's accidental or fluky bringings about of things are actions. Nevertheless, I think that reflection shows that this conception of action is secondary or derivative. It depends on a prior conception of action as essentially the exercise of an ability. And for this conception of ability, but not for the other, it is true that action suffices for ability. I mean, to see this, it may help to note that certain types of failures, as well as successes, may be manifestations of ability. For instance, an excellent goalkeeper gets a hand on an unstoppable shot that a lesser keeper wouldn't have got near. So even though he failed to make the save, he certainly acted, and his action was an exercise of his goalkeeping abilities. So we can't capture our concept of ability by relying solely on the thought that it's manifested in successful instances. Now, some successful instances, conceived of as mere bringings about, are not manifestations of ability at all, like the lucky bullseye hit, whereas some failures to bring about the effect that was desired or intended may nevertheless be manifestations of ability, the goalkeeper who gets his hand on the nevertheless unstoppable shot. Sometimes all the skill in the world can't yield success, but that doesn't mean there's no action or that skill or ability wasn't on display. Now, though this perhaps shows the difference between the two conceptions of action, action as the successful bringing about of effects or states of affairs, and action as essentially the exercise of ability, it doesn't yet show why we should think of the latter conception as more fundamental than the former. But it's clear that in order to bring it about that P, one must bring P about in some way or other. Some ability or competence must be exercised, even if it's not an ability to bring it about that P. So consider the following remarks made by Barbara Vetter in the course of wondering whether there might be some truth in the idea that if she, a weak darts player, hit the bullseye, then she's nevertheless got the ability to hit the bullseye. This is number 15. Vetter writes, I have arms and the muscles and bodily makeup required to throw a dart, and there's nothing to prevent me from throwing a dart that lands in the bullseye. I've been known to hit it by luck now and then. Surely I can hit the bullseye, even if I'm no good at it. Potentialities, this is a technical term she introduces, potentialities, even where the subject and manifestation are both agentive, agent and action, are less demanding than abilities. Not every potentiality is an ability. Thus I have a potentiality to hit the bullseye, even though that potentiality fails to qualify as an ability. So Vetter agrees with the majority that she doesn't have the ability to hit the bullseye, because hitting the bullseye is not within her control. But the fact that she actually did hit the bullseye seems to show more than that it's metaphysically possible for her to hit the bullseye. Vetter says that it shows that she's got the potentiality to hit the bullseye, where an ability will end up being a distinctive and more demanding kind of potentiality. But notice that what underwrote, what explained her hitting the bullseye was, of course, not the ability to hit the bullseye, but those of her bodily abilities that she deployed in grasping and gripping and throwing the dart at the board at which she was looking and aiming. These abilities, grasping, gripping, throwing and so on, rather than the potentiality to hit the bullseye is what accounted, or at least accounted in part, for her hitting the bullseye. So thus, by another route and in a different way, I think we've undermined here the idea that abilities can be distinguished from dispositions simply by characterizing their manifestations as actions. For if action in the fundamental sense is essentially the exercise of ability, then we'll be going round in a circle that seems far too tight to be illuminating if we appeal to the idea that abilities are manifested in actions in order to distinguish them from other dispositions. Now, this might suggest that the only way to distinguish abilities from dispositions, after all, is by appealing to trying, and thus to plump for the counterfactual conditional view. But this would be right only if trying were a causal condition on the exercise of ability, if an act of trying were conceived of as a trigger or stimulus of a disposition. And this idea, I think, is completely misguided, although there isn't really time to go into it now. All I'll say is that this picture conjures up an image of my body as a machine, the passive operations of which are kick-started by what I really do, namely try to act. So I think it's a mistake to interpret the if I tried in I would if I tried as identifying a causal condition, and so a mistake to interpret the conditional as a causal counterfactual, as it's supposed to be in the glass would break if it were struck. Rather, it seems to me, in articulating trying and as an aspect of what's going on when an ability is exercised, the conditional view is best thought of as making explicit not one of the conditions of or inputs to a disposition that's formally no different from fragility, flammability, and so on, but rather making explicit a formal character of ability which marks it out as a distinctive form of power. Abilities are volitional powers. They're exercised at will. Now, the idea that abilities are exercised at will, or that the kinds of active powers central to human agency are exercised at will, is sometimes described through the idea of a two-way power. A two-way power is supposed to be a power to do something or not. Helen Stewart, Maria Alvarez, and Anthony Kenny all describe a power that's exercised as will, a power exercised at will as a two-way power, a power to phi or not to phi. But the idea of a two-way power is, in my view, an extremely bad gloss, a useless gloss, really, on the idea of a volitional power, a power that's exercised at will. Kenny, Stewart, and Alvarez, for instance, all slide between characterizing this so-called two-way power as a conjunction of abilities or a single disjunctive ability. Right, so they slide between saying of one who has a two-way power to phi that she has the ability to phi and the ability not to phi, and saying of someone with a two-way power that she has the ability to phi or not to phi. Now, when they're being precise, Stewart comes down on the side of a conjunction of abilities, two abilities, and Alvarez and Kenny come down on the side of the disjunctive ability. Stewart claims that the ability to sing is not, strictly speaking, a single power with two opposed exercises, singing and not singing, but rather two powers, an active power to sing and a passive power to not sing. And she's got a very good reason for saying this. This is number 16, towards the top of page 4. Stewart says, for me, not exercising a power, even a two-way power, is not a way of exercising it. It's very fundamental for me that agency involves exercise. The agent has to do something in order to act. But she doesn't have to do anything in order not to act, and thus not acting does not count as an exercise of a two-way power. The fundamental kind of exercise of the power of singing is simply singing. Why then say that singing, like other active powers, is normally a two-way power? Because I'm currently able both to exercise it and not to exercise it, and these two abilities are connected in that one's exercise would not count as active if the power not to exercise the ability were not simultaneously present. But this second power, in the light of which we judge the first to have the active character it does, is a power whose realization is merely passive. Now, it's surely right to hold that someone who's simply not singing is not exercising an ability to sing. There doesn't seem to be anything actually, as opposed to potentially, different, singing-wise, between two sleeping agents, one who has the ability to sing and one who lacks it. But perhaps only an agent who has the ability to sing can refrain from singing. And there are surely many occasions on which someone who has the ability to sing is neither singing nor refraining from singing, but simply not singing, and so not exercising her ability to sing or refrain from singing. Now, the difference between simply not singing And refraining from singing surely involves the fact that one who refrains from singing chooses not to sing. Refraining is to that extent active. Nevertheless, there still seems to be something wrong with characterizing someone who actively refrains from singing as thereby exercising her power to sing. Hasn't she precisely chosen not to exercise her power to sing? So while it's right to say that one can refrain from doing only what one has the ability and indeed the opportunity to do, this doesn't imply that in so refraining, one exercises that ability. The act of choice that constitutes one's refraining from singing is not itself an act of the power to sing. So Stewart is absolutely right to reject the Kenny Alvarez construal of the idea of a two-way power as a disjunctive power that can be exercised in singing or not singing. But Stewart's own view, the two powers view, is equally hopeless, as I think Alvarez sees. Any agent who possesses both the active power to sing and the passive power not to sing will find herself in situations where she's got the opportunity to either sing or not sing. And as Alvarez points out, this is number 17, if an agent had the ability and opportunity to phi and also the ability and opportunity not to phi at time t, and this were the conjunction of one-way powers, then the agent would both phi and not phi at t. But that's impossible. As it's not possible to realize both one's active power to sing and one's passive power not to sing at the same time, an act of will, or something like it, needs to be called upon to explain which power is exercised. But if an act of will is needed, then this second passive power is just an idle wheel. The active power to sing is simply a power that's exercised at will. So once that idle wheel's discarded, we're back where we started with the idea of an ability as a volitional power, one that's exercised at will. So I conclude that Stewart and Alvarez are each right about why the other's elucidation of the idea of a volitional power in terms of a two-way power goes wrong. But I think the conclusion ought to be that no idea of a second way of exercising ability, or a second ability that piggybacks on the first, can explicate the idea of an ability as a power that's exercised at will. So to sum up, the concept of ability marks something of a lacuna in the philosophy of action. Filling the gap ought to be of interest to all of us, though perhaps it should be of special interest to those who are dissatisfied with the standard story of action in both its plain and embellished versions. It's clearly of interest to philosophers working on other topics. So perhaps my main goal was simply to exhort and encourage philosophers of action to take the concept of ability seriously. The usually partial accounts of ability that philosophers in other areas come up with to serve their own purposes very often only work for examples of a very particular kind, and they're typically ill-suited to play any interesting explanatory role in the metaphysics of agency. So I think philosophers of action ought to be working on understanding abilities. We ought to be doing it for our own sake and for theirs. My subsidiary goals were primarily negative. I sought to provide some reasons arising from reflections on the metaphysics of agency for thinking that a number of common claims, distinctions and assumptions about abilities need to be rethought. So I said the idea that different uses of is able to and has the ability to suffice for introducing different kinds of ability, that idea ought to be resisted. I said that abilities are essentially general. Indeed, I argued that they're more general than they're often taken to be. It's not the case that a specification of what an agent did in exercising her abilities is thereby a specification of an ability of hers. Many specifications of performances are too fine-grained to be specifications of the abilities exercised in them. Abilities come in different shapes or degrees, but only a restricted set of examples of this phenomenon can be accommodated by the resources wheeled in from theories of disposition and possibility, proportion of successes to attempts, successes in a wider range of circumstances or a larger range of possible worlds. Abilities are powers of a distinctive kind, but this can't be understood simply by saying they're powers of agents or agents qua agents, and that their manifestations are actions. It's not that they're dispositions with distinctive triggers or distinctive manifestations, but that they are powers with a distinctive form. They're volitional powers, powers exercised at will. But the idea of an ability as a volitional power can't be elucidated through the idea of a so-called two-way power. That's not to say that there mightn't be some other conception of a two-way power that might have a key role to play in a positive account of practical abilities. Indeed, I think there is, but that's a story for another day.